Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts is my name, and Bill Barlee is our storyteller and historian. And today, we've told a number of stories on this program about great British Columbians. The hanging judge, Matthew Bailey Begbie, Dunsmuir, of course, the coal boss down on the coast, and Fritz Augustus Hines, and many others. But there's a story we have left till today, and he is a spectacular, larger-than-life character. Who are we talking about?
Yeah, star-crossed figure, Mike, no doubt about it. Francis Rattenbury. His friends called him Rats, and some in a different sense when they called him that. He was flamboyant. He was gifted, very talented man. He was an architect, and when you look at the inner harbor of Victoria, you see Rattenbury. You see the Parliament buildings, the present Parliament buildings, the Empress, and all his talent has gone into that area. He didn't have a lot of close friends, surprisingly. His early career was extremely promising. He called himself one of the greatest promoters in British Columbia. In many respects, he was. But his life was, I think, full of disappointments, not much doubt about it, some great triumphs. So we will go through his life from start to finish and end up with rather a sad chapter in the story of Francis Rattenbury.
A book that you highly recommend is called Rattenbury, and this is published by Victoria Press, Sononi.
Yeah.
And tell me about the author.
Well, Terry Rexton, I think, is one of the great historical authors of British Columbia. Not much doubt about it. I've read a number of her books. She did an excellent job on the Dunsmuir family, and she's a careful researcher. She has good cadence in her writing, and she's usually right. And she gets into the characters that she writes about. And whether they impress her or do not, it always comes out on paper. So I would highly recommend that if anyone's interested in Rattenbury, and I think a lot of people will be interested in Rattenbury, by all means, get Rexton's Rattenbury.
I always think when I read these histories that this just is crying for sort of a great performances, television adaptation, getting some great actor to do this, because these people are the equivalent of any that have ever been portrayed.
Oh yeah, it'd be a marvelous, marvelous storyline.
All right, we're going to talk about Rattenbury, Francis Rattenbury,
correct,
the great British Columbian architect. We'll do that right after this break. Back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns, we're talking about the preeminent architect of early British Columbia, Francis Rattenbury, and in the front page of the book by Terry Rexton, a photograph of him that shows him to be very dramatic, full of himself, very much a dandy, I guess.
Oh, indeed he was. He dressed to the T's. And, you know, it's interesting because he came from a rather wealthy family, certainly upper middle class in England, in Bradford, which is one of the old and famous wool towns in England. When I say towns, a city of many hundreds of thousands. And one of his maternal uncles was with a firm of architects called Mawson and Lockwood. Lockwood, of course, was a senior partner and was very, very famous in England, actually as an architect, and had done a number of civic buildings around Bradford and in other parts, including London, and was recognized as such. So young Rattenbury decided at an early age that he would become an architect. He wasn't too interested in schooling per se and the restrictions of the public school in England, so he became an architect with his uncle's firm. And he was born in 1867.
Canada was birth of Canada. There you go. Yep.
And so by 1895, at 18 years old, he entered the firm. Stayed there, Mike, right through to about 1891 or 92. And then felt after 6 years in the firm that he had learned all they could teach him, and probably he was right. Now that seems a little arrogant, but that was not unusual for Rattenbury. So he looked around the world, very, very interesting individual, high intellect, and decided which of the towns in Canada, which was booming at that time, would be the most appropriate town to go to.
Because he knew he could make his mark by choosing wisely.
Of course, if the town grew at a rapid pace, Mike, he would be doing, he thought, some of the civic buildings. So he chose Vancouver, which was the terminus of the CPR, and went into Vancouver and built several buildings there. Didn't really make his mark in Vancouver, surprisingly enough. But in 1893, got to Vancouver, built the Rhodey House and so on. Went into Vancouver in 1893. The provincial government led a contract for architects all across the province, and it was a $600,000 building to replace the old Parliament buildings in Victoria, which were commonly called the bird cages, and they were going to impose it with, at least exchange it with a grandiose structure that they felt would be indicative of the power of British Columbia. So this was open to all of the architects in British Columbia. 67 entered the competition, including such eminent architects as Samuel McClure. And the young architect, of course, who was 24 or 25 years old, Rattenbury, decided to enter, which was really quite surprising. And he had lots of competition.
So this is an example of a mansion in Victoria. I think this one's called Roslyn.
That's right.
And that might be, some of the indicators might be McClure, because it had sunbursts and stuff.
That's right.
That would be a famous mansion.
Oh, yeah, it'd be really quite spectacular.
Stained glass windows, lots of arches.
Victoria was very wealthy in the 1890s and the late 1880s, Mike.
This one here, even larger. Look at, and see the Lord of the Manor with his big cane down in the front there?
And the Lord of the Manor was Captain William Irving, who was a sternwheeler captain and owned a series of, a fleet of sternwheelers on the Fraser and other parts of British Columbia.
So into this environment comes a 24-year-old upstart named Rattenbury, and everybody else has pretty much got the ground staked out. Very competitive, very good, tried and true. But Rattenbury wins.
He was very brash. It took British Columbia by absolute storm and by surprise with all the other architects who were, needless to say, rather envious, except for Samuel McClure, who was, you know, had his own clients, and they didn't waver from him at all. So Rattenbury comes in and he starts to work on the Parliament buildings, and it's really quite impressive. He runs into a contractor who had also taken a contract on it, a guy named Adams. And Rattenbury, unfortunately, runs afoul of not only Adams, but the provincial government at the time. They were trying to hold the costs down, and he was trying to drive them up. The more he drove them up, of course, the greater his fee, essentially speaking.
Well, also the greater the edifice he could create for himself. He would be really aware of this.
This is Gloria, you see.
But what's he doing, for example? Because I hear, because I used to live in Duncan, and there were Spoke Sila quarries there. He didn't want anything to do with that rock. It wasn't good enough.
He had to have the very best marble in British Columbia. Not ordinary marble, not good marble, but the most superlative marble you could find anywhere, regardless of the cost. But the cost, unfortunately, fell back on the shoulders of Adams. And Adams was eventually had to retire. He was bankrupt, and went to look for some cheaper marble, which he thought he could pick up even after his bankruptcy, and died actually on a ship that went down called the Velas. And that didn't slow Rattenbury down at all. He continued to bully the provincial government, was successful in doing so, and began to make a name for himself. And into the scene strides another larger-than-life individual, a guy called Patrick Burns. We call him Pat Burns. And this is meatpacking fame. One of the great meat packer of Western Canada. Had stores all over British Columbia and into parts of Alberta. So he becomes a fast acquaintance and friend, actually, I guess, to a degree, of Burns. And Burns had married well as well. He had married into a very important family in the Okanagan, where he got his meat from, and that was Tom Ellis, of course. And so he had both parts of his empire working very well. And Rattenbury built Burns's house in Calgary, which at that time was pretty expensive. And this is a photograph of the house of Pat Burns in Calgary, which is pretty impressive.
A house that meat built.
That's right, indeed. And Burns, of course, had a long-range vision. And he looked at the Yukon, and at that time, 1896, when Rattenbury was busy with the Parliament buildings, the Yukon was in the forefront of news all around the world. They thought there were lots of possibilities there. And so Pat Burns and Rattenbury formed a partnership. And it was a kind of a joint venture, and they launched a series of ships, sternwheelers, really in the Yukon, which Rattenbury named the Arctic Express. He thought this would be the pinnacle of his career.
That's the fleet, the Arctic Express, owned by Rattenbury and Burns.
And he married at the same time a woman called Florence Nuns, who was really, you know, I kind of feel sorry for her. She certainly wasn't, by the standards of the day or today, very beautiful, but she was evidently a very, very fine woman. She wasn't, however, Rattenbury's helpmate for the rest of his life. And I think they both realized this very soon into their marriage. But he showered her with jewels, named one of his stern wheelers the Flora after her, Florence, and he also had another one called the Nora and another one called the Aura. And unfortunately, the Flora, Aura, and Nora were not very successful because the rush was over the top by then, Mike.
A little derivative. He wasn't too imaginative in that. He left imaginative boat naming to someone else. Buildings were his forte.
Yeah, indeed he did.
So he didn't succeed well. He and Burns lost cash on this?
Well, yeah, he did. But some backers who had backed him, feeling that they were backing a genius, which they were, but he made a mistake, and as I say, his timing was poor in that, and he lost a fair amount of his own money and lost a lot of the money of people who had backed him in this venture. So he came back to British Columbia ready to do battle again, and did some battle, and actually was able to secure a number of contracts. And one of the contracts which he inveigled Sir Thomas Shaughnessy, who was head of the CPR, and a very, very hard-nosed individual, who made the statement that he would never build a hotel in Victoria. Well,
that was Shaughnessy's
That was Shaughnessy's
vow.
statement. Oh,
Yeah.
definitely. He was not going to move from it at all. After he'd been with 2 or 3 meetings with Rattenbury, he decided that he would not only build a hotel in Victoria, he would build a grand hotel in Victoria with several hundred rooms, and this, of course, is the famous Empress, which is there to this day.
Gee, when you think about Victoria and its pivotal look,
Yeah.
there with the Empress, there with the Houses
sure.
of Parliament, this
That's
entire harbor is Rattenbury.
Oh, of course it is. It's the touch of Rattenbury, that touch of genius, which he certainly possessed, and nobody would debate that point. And he built other edifices all around the province, Mike. He built in Nelson. He built the courthouse in Nelson. He built
That courthouse, now, that looks like he sort of did the design that everybody else emulated. If they couldn't do it in stone or brick, they'd do it in wood, and it would look like one of Rattenbury.
Yeah, that's true. So he went all through the Kootenays, and that's actually essentially where he met Pat Burns originally. Did the courthouse in Rossland, and this is an example of the courthouse in Rossland. Both of these buildings still stand, thank heavens. And I remember them well, of course, especially the courthouse in Rossland, which is up on Columbia Avenue.
Stomping around as a child. How old were you when you were thundering around
Well,
there?
when I was thundering around Rossland, I guess I was 5 to about 11 years old. So
I can understand this made an imprint on you.
Oh yeah, of course it did. Marvelous.
When you contemplate this inner harbor now,
Yeah.
this is now seen by, well, hundreds of ships called Victoria their port.
Oh sure.
And so millions of people would perceive Rattenbury's architecture as the colony.
Yeah, they're quite impressed with the grand stature of the building. It has stained glass windows throughout. It has marble throughout. It has statuary and so on. And it's really quite well planned. It wasn't perfect, as his critics pointed out in no uncertain terms that it was not perfect, nor was Rattenbury. And so anyway,
So they kind of put him back on track after losing some ground to Burns. Did he make it up with Shaughnessy? Or
yeah, what he did, not only that, when he made it up with Shaughnessy in the Empress, and this was a very good contract for him, he met a very interesting man called Charles M. Hayes. And Charles M. Hayes was probably the genius, I think, behind the CPR in the early years. He saved the CPR. He decided, however, to branch out on his own, become the CEO, essentially, of the Grand Trunk Pacific, which was going to oppose the CPR. It would become, in Hayes's eyes, the great rival of the CPR. The CPR would go through the southern route into Vancouver along the Fraser, whereas the Grand Trunk Pacific would go along rivers in the northern part and end up at a little town they soon named Prince Rupert.
He didn't want to go head-to-head with him. He just wanted to be the Canadian Pacific of northern and central British Columbia.
That's right, because the Canadian Pacific had the empresses running across to other parts of the world, especially to the Orient and Japan and so on.
So this route to Prince Rupert was going to be Hayes's, and if Rattenbury plays his cards right, their fortune.
Yeah, that's right. And Rattenbury, of course, had still a lot of money, and he had done very, very well on all his contracts. So he bought 11,000 acres in the Chaco Valley.
He knew something.
Yeah, he did. He had an inside track, certainly by Hayes. And this is 1911, 1910 in there. And then he decided to buy 50,000 acres in the Bulkley Valley. So he was all ready for the railroad to come through and knew which side of the rivers they were coming on, you know, the Skeena and so on.
Yeah.
And he was all poised. And his strategy actually was very, very good. One flaw, Mike, didn't count on faith. And fate itself is kind of an interesting thing, because what happened was Hayes made a trip to England to secure all the contracts he needed in 1912. And he went
And they
to,
were
went to
still
London.
willing to invest. There
You
was
bet they
still
were.
lots of money there.
Yeah, they believed in the genius of Hayes. He secured the contracts, was coming back on a ship called the Titanic with the contracts. And the Titanic went down after it hit an iceberg. And the last thing they saw of Hayes, when he was waving goodbye to his wife and his daughter, and he was leaning over the ship and fondly waving them goodbye. And he went down with the Titanic, and they were saved. And when Hayes went down with the Titanic, Mike, essentially the vision of the Grand Trunk Pacific was dimmed considerably, and it was hastened to an early demise, really. 1914, war broke out. Fortunately for Rattenbury, he was able to bail out just prior to that a lot of his property in the Bulkley Valley and some of his property in the Nechako. So he didn't lose everything, but he lost a fair amount. And it was a blow to the pride of Rattenbury, so that the Grand Trunk Pacific never became the great rival of the CPR.
What an amazing piece of connections. Always one of my favorite programs is Connections. And now here, what does the Titanic sinking have to do with the collapse of empires in British Columbia? Pivotally, there it is.
So the difference was that Rattenbury then decided he would have to come back to Victoria. He was going to be a gentleman of leisure and empire builder. That fell through. So he came back to Victoria with his tail between his legs and attempted to set himself up in the practice of architecture again. It didn't really work. He and his wife, Florence, were not getting along well at all. They had 2 children by this time. And he, you know, it's funny, he didn't seem to have any love affairs or anything with other women, but he was certainly not happy in the domestic partnership he had formed with Florence Nunn. And they became equally disenchanted with each other, shall we say?
Estranged,
yeah.
yes.
And the result was his business did not prosper. So we go through.
If you weren't sort of in polite society and able to pull it off with aplomb, you kind of were shunned.
Yeah, he was, but not as much as soon after. So for about 5 or 6 years or 7 years there, he really wasn't at his best. Finally, in 1923, he was given a contract to build a center for tourists in Victoria. It was about $200,000 contract, and he would do quite well on that indeed. So he went out, and of course the celebration was, he addressed all sorts of groups in Victoria, civic groups and everyone in Victoria, taxpayers and everything else, and essentially sold it through the strength of his personality. And he was feeling rather good about himself, and he went to celebrate in the Empress, and his friends held, I say friends or acquaintances, held a do for him in the Empress. And it was quite a wild affair. They were singing raucously and drinking pretty heavily. But in the other part of the Empress, which was unusual, a young woman was playing the piano. And she was Alma Victoria Pakenham. As a child, she had been a child prodigy. She had had 2 concertos with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra at the age of 17, played the violin in one and played the piano in the other, which is really quite rare. She was...
At 17. This was her night.
That's right. And here's what she looked like in about 1923.
Isn't she a modern-looking woman?
Yes,
and
she is indeed.
Attractive?
And they say that men were absolutely bowled over by this woman. She was intelligent. She was articulate. She was artistic. She was a great beauty by any standards of the day. And at the time, she'd just finished playing this piece on the piano, and somebody said, oh, I should introduce you to Rattenbury. Rattenbury at this time was 56 years old, Mike.
Yes.
She was 27, and Rattenbury looked like this photograph here, which is taken just a few years earlier, about 10 years earlier. And in fact, and here's a later photograph, which is almost exactly what he looked like at that time. Certainly had not been kindly treated by time, by Father Time, or Mother Time. And so he met this young woman, easily young enough to be his daughter. She fell head over heels in love with Rattenbury. Absolutely head over heels.
And he with her.
And he with her. It was a star-crossed venture for both of them. They didn't know it at the time. And he began to squire her around publicly in Victoria, which in the 1920s soon spelled finis to his architectural career.
This was just not done. You could not do this in polite society.
That's right. Even his old friends, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel McClure, could not stand for it, and he treated his wife abominably. And in fact, when he and Alma were entertaining themselves in his house, she was upstairs trying to go to sleep, and they were carrying on till all hours of the night. Alma sat down and played the funeral march for the benefit of his wife, who was
Cruel.
estranged, but not. Yeah, it was out of character, I think, for her. But this soon got around in Victoria, and the result was almost everyone in Victoria, including the McClures, sided with Florence. And so soon after, there was a complete break, and Rattenbury built a house for his ex-wife and gave her a certain amount of money per month, and became divorced. And by 1930, they decided, because Victoria had not treated them well, they were persona non grata in British Columbia, they decided to move to England. And there comes the second chapter of the story of Francis Mawson Rattenbury.
Okay, we'll take a little break here and come back to find out how all of this story ends right after these words. Don't go away. Welcome back. 1934, Rattenbury and Alma, his lovely lady, have now returned to Bournemouth, England.
Yep.
He's not doing so well. They're not in society, and a hireling is the undoing here.
Yeah, Rattenbury sinks into that slough of despondency. He's drinking heavily, and Alma decides to hire a gardener and a chauffeur. She advertises in the local paper, and a young lad whose name is George Percy Stoner comes along, and he applies for the job. He's not very bright, but he's rather pleasant looking and well built, and before we know it, by the next year, they're deeply in love, and they have an affair, a continuous affair. And the result, I think, which is obvious, that what happens is Alma wants to take Rattenbury on a trip. Stoner flies into a fit of rage, and essentially he goes downstairs and beats Rattenbury to death. He didn't die that day, but the result was he died a few days later. Both Alma and Stoner are arraigned in Old Bailey, the most famous court in England. She is found not guilty, and he is found guilty and sentenced to life. He's sentenced to hang, actually. Eventually that was commuted to life imprisonment. But before Alma found out that it was commuted, she left her nursing home and went out on a railway and went to the River Avon, sat on the banks for a few minutes, then walked into that historic river and stabbed herself to death. And so that was the end of the Rattenbury family, and kind of an ill-started love affair.
Now, eventually, this Stoner did have a sentence commuted,
Yes,
and he lived till the 60s or
That's
sometime.
right. Yeah, he lived a long time thereafter.
What an amazing story. Rattenbury, at
Yeah.
24, has everything in the palm of
Yeah.
his hand, and his edifice is Victoria Inner Harbor today,
Of course it is.
but he could not have a happy ending.
That's absolutely true.
Excellent story. Thank you very much, Bill.
You're welcome.
The story is of Francis Mawson Rattenbury, British Columbia's greatest architect. And that's our story from Gold Trails and Ghost Towns today. We'll be back again next time to tell you more stories about the development of British Columbia, and maybe we'll even get into some lost gold next time. We'll see you next time Gold Trails is on.